David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9, I Have a Memorable Birthday. I pass over all that happened at school until the anniversary of my birthday came round in March. It was after breakfast, and we had been summoned in from the playground when Mr. Sharp entered and said, "David Copperfield is to go into the parlour." I expected a hamper from Peggotty, and brightened at the order. Some of the boys about me put in their claim not to be forgotten in the distribution of the good things. But as I got out of my seat with great alacrity, "Don't hurry, David," said Mr. Sharp. "There's time enough, my boy. Don't hurry." I might have been surprised by the tone in which he spoke, if I had given it a thought, but I gave it none until afterward. I hurried away to the parlour, and there I found Mr. Creakle sitting at his breakfast, with the cane and newspaper before him, and Mrs. Creakle with an open letter in her hand, but no hamper. "David Copperfield," said Mrs. Creakle, leading me to a sofa and sitting down beside me, "I want to speak to you very particularly. I have something to tell you, my child." Mr. Creakle, at whom of course I looked, shook his head without looking at me, and stopped up a sigh with a very large piece of buttered toast. "You are too young to know how the world changes every day," said Mrs. Creakle, "and how the people in it pass away. But we all have to learn it, David, some of us when we are young, some of us when we are old, some of us at all times of our lives." I looked at her earnestly. "When you came away from home at the end of vacation," said Mrs. Creakle, after a pause, "were they all well?" After another pause, "Was your mamma well?" I trembled, without distinctly knowing why, and still looked at her earnestly, making no attempt to answer. "Because," she said, "I grieve to tell you that I hear this morning your mamma is very ill." A mist rose between Mrs. Creakle and me, and her figure seemed to move in it for an instant. Then I felt the burning tears run down my face, and it was steady again. "She is very dangerously ill," she added. I knew all now. "She is dead." There was no need to tell me so. I had already broken out into a desolate cry and felt an orphan in the wide world. She was very kind to me. She kept me there all day, and left me alone sometimes, and I cried and wore myself to sleep, and awoke and cried again when I could cry no more. I began to think, and then the oppression on my breast was heavy, was heaviest, and my grief a dull pain, and there was no ease for. I left Salem House upon the morrow afternoon. I little thought then that I left it never to return. We traveled very slowly all night, and did not get into Yarmouth before 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I looked out for Barkis, but he was not there, and instead of him, a fat, short-winded, merry-looking little old man in black with rusty little bunches of ribbons at the knees of his breeches, black stockings, and a broad-brimmed hat came puffing up to the coach window and said, "Master Copperfield." "Yes, sir." "Will you come with me, young sir, if you please," he said, opening the door, "and I shall have the pleasure of taking you home." I put my hand in his, wondering who he was, and we walked away to a shop in a narrow street, on which was written, "Omer, draper, tailor, haberdasher, funeral furnisher, etc." It was a close and stifling little shop, full of all sorts of clothing, made and unmade, including one window full of beaver hats and bonnets. We went into a little back parlour behind the shop, where we found 3 young women at work on a quantity of black material which were heaped upon the table, and little bits and cuttings of which were littered all over the floor. There was a good fire in the room, and a breathless smell of warm black crepe. I did not know what the smell was then, but I know now. The 3 young women, who appeared to be very insidious and comfortable, raised their heads to look at me, and then went on with their work. Stitch, stitch, stitch. At the same time, there came from a workshop across a little yard outside the window a regular sound of hammering that kept a kind of tune, rat-tat-tat, 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 without any variation. "Well," said my conductor to the 3 young women, "how do you get on, Minnie?" We shall be ready by the trying-on time, she replied gaily without looking up. Don't you be afraid, father. Mr. Omer took off his broad-brimmed hat and sat down and panted. He was so fat, he was obliged to pant sometime before he could say, That's right. Father, said Minnie playfully, what a porpoise you do grow. Well, I don't know how it is. That's my dear, he replied, considering about it. I am rather so. You are such a comfortable man, you see, said Minnie. You take things so easy. No use taking them otherwise, my dear, said Mr. Omer, as I have got my breath now. I think I'll measure this young scholar. Would you walk into the shop, Master Copperfield? I proceeded, Mr. Omer in compliance with his request, and after showing me a roll of cloth, which he said was extra super and too good mourning for anything short of parents, he took my various dimensions and put them down in a book. I have been acquainted with you, said Mr. Omer. I have been acquainted with you a long time, my young friend. Have you, sir? All your life, said Mr. Omer. I may say, before it, I knew your father before you. He was 5'9½", and he lays in 25 foot of ground. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat across the yard. He lays in 25 foot of ground if he lays in a fraction, said Mr. Omer pleasantly. It was either his request or her direction. I forget which. Do you know how my little brother is? I inquired. Mr. Omer shook his head. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. He is in his mother's arms, said he. Oh, poor little fellow, is he dead? Don't mind it more than you can help, said Mr. Omer. Yes, the baby's dead. Presently the tune left off, and a good-looking young fellow came across the yard into the room. He had a hammer in his hand, and his mouth was full of little nails, which he was obliged to take out before he could speak. Well, Joram, said Mr. Omer, how do you get on? All right, said Joram. Done, sir. Will you give me your opinion of it? I will, said Mr. Omer, rising. My dear, he stopped and turned to me. Would you like to see your... No, father, Minnie interposed. I thought it might be agreeable, my dear, said Mr. Omer. I'll pause here while the siren goes past. And I apologize, folks, if you know anything about Kentley Studios, you know we are right next to a fire station. This is probably the longest siren we've had in a video in a long time. And back to it. I thought it might be agreeable, my dear, said Mr. Omer, but perhaps you're right. I can't say how I knew it was my dear, dear mother's coffin that they went to look at. I had never heard one making. I had never seen one that I know of, but it came into my mind what the noise was, what was going on, and when the young man entered, I was sure I knew what he had been doing. The chaise soon came round to the front of the shop. I remember it as a kind of half-chaise cart, half pianoforte van, painted of a somber color, and drawn by a black horse with a long tail. When we reached home, I dropped out of the chaise behind, as quickly as possible. I was in Peggotty's arms before I got to the door, and she took me into the house. Her grief burst out when she first saw me, but she controlled it soon, and spoke in whispers, and walked softly, as if the dead could be disturbed. She had not been in bed, I found, for a long time. She had sat up all night. She sat up at night still and watched. As long as her poor dear pretty was above the ground, she said, she would never desert her. Mr. Murdstone took no heed of me when I went into the parlor, where he was, but sat by the fireside, weeping silently and pondering on his elbow chair. Miss Murdstone, who had been busy at her writing desk, which was covered with letters and papers, gave me her cold fingernails, and asked me, in an iron whisper, if I had been measured for my mourning. I said, yes. "And your shirts," said Miss Murdstone. "Have you brought 'em home?" "Yes, ma'am, I've brought home all my clothes." This was all the consultation that her firmness administered to me. I had no doubt that she had a choice pleasure in exhibiting what she called her self-command, and her firmness and her strength of mind and her common sense and the whole diabolical catalogue of her unamiable qualities on such an occasion. If the funeral had been yesterday, I could not recollect it better. The very air of the best parlour, when I went in at the door, the bright condition of the fire, the shining of the wine in the decanters, the patterns of the glasses and plates, the faint sweet smell of cake, the odour of Miss Murdstone's dress and our black clothes. When we got out to the door, the bearers and their load are in the garden, and they move before us down the path and past the elms and through the gate and into the churchyard, where I have so often heard the birds sing on a summer morning. We stand around the grave. The day seems different to me from every other day, and the light not of the same color, of a sadder color. Now there is a solemn hush which we have brought from home when we are resting in the mould, and while we stand bareheaded, I hear the voice of the clergyman, sounding remote in the open air, and yet distinct and plain, saying, "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord." And then I hear sobs, and standing apart among the lookers-on, I see that good and faithful servant, whom of all the people upon earth I love the best, and unto whom my childish heart is certain that the Lord will one day say, "Well done." It is over, and the earth is filled in, and we turn to come away. Before us stands our house, so pretty and unchanged, so linked in my mind with the young idea of what is gone, that all my sorrow has been nothing to the sorrow it calls forth. And that is the end of chapter 9.